Eric Parry is a Royal Academician and founder and principal of Eric Parry Architects, a firm whose work has had a significant impact on the face of London, an impact which will peak when one undershaft, proposed to be the tallest building in the city cluster, is completed. And he recently received planning permission for a 35-storey tower at 50 Fenchurch Street. Now, Eric, you've always struck me as one of the more cerebral architects of your generation, and your website is populated with discussions with intellectual heavyweights like Joseph Rickworth, Dalibor Vézelay, Robin Middleton, Peter Carl. Yet you're also one of the most successful designers of commercial developments of your generation. So the two tend not to go in hand in this country. And is this how you saw your career panning out? And I've always seemed to, I think back to the days when you were working with Stuart Lipton and on the reception in the Berkeley Square offices, as well as at Stockley Park back in the 1980s.
It was a very unlikely moment to come across Stuart Lipton. That was what set me off thinking or getting more involved in office buildings, commercial space, the workspace. So that fit out for Stanhope's was my first encounter, and it was a pretty tough one with 80 project managers. You know, it's an incredibly fascinating world, of course, and it's like any other. You need to, I was challenged by Stuart Lipton actually when he turned over my drawings and said, tell me about the culture of my organization. And so I felt at home there. You know, there's the ethics of development, what a developer is doing short term and long term. And we had a really good conversation for at least half an hour, which set the scene for a rite of passage, which is, I haven't been the first port of call for most developers. I really don't believe so, because what I bring is that background that you alluded to, which essentially is a conversation about the European city. That's what's common, I think, to all the people you mentioned. And those were both, those were the textbooks of urban studies. And I think going further back, an interest that started with architecture through the reading of Nicholas Pevsner, for instance. You know, those are really important in order to create a framework into which one could begin to design buildings. So I've always thought about buildings, you know, as being part of an urban ensemble, essentially. Stockley Park, of course, is different, but that was my next opportunity. So at each opportunity, when it has arisen, it has been about thinking, of course, about a three-dimensional puzzle that is to do with balancing the optimization that developers are always after with the necessary sense of civic presence, if you like. You know, whether the building is in a street or a square or a composite of those, whether it's a collage of new and old. So it is from those ideas about the city that it's all been generated, really.
You talk about the role of architects as arbitrators between the planning system and the developers, particularly in the absence of a proactive planning system. And your success would suggest that developers are looking for architects to play that role. Can you describe your relationship with developers?
Yeah, well, I think going back to academic sort of circumstance, because for a long time I was lecturing. I was actually, I was responsible, Sandy Wilson kind of gave me the third year to run at Cambridge. And a lot of that was about technical issues. And I was learning through teaching, you know, and I spent through the last studios and then onwards, always, I've been incredibly interested in all those issues about building. That's maybe why there was a kind of mutually useful relationship between the intellectuals who weren't actually at the coalface, so to speak, and my position. I was always trying to bridge between theory and practice has always meant conversations with those involved in the technology and the continuity of ideas in construction. Of course, that's completely fascinating. So I think that having a hand in both sides is incredibly important when it comes to both talking to developers, a kind of there's a pragmatism that's rather important, and then you have a kind of if you could say a poetic card that is part of a language that is basically to do with culture and continuity, and so the one's bringing both of those aspects together in conversations, bridging between developers and where possible planning, the openness of the planning system. And it's been particularly interesting, obviously, working over a number of years in the City of London, because there's an ongoing change that requires very careful calibration, of which you find, you become a sounding board for those ideas which are part of the history of cities. And then, of course, in London, you referred to London. What is obviously magical is the continuing comparisons that are drawn from different parts of the rich tapestry of the different parts of London.
So do you actually feel more comfortable with the idea of, let's say, the negotiated planning system, which we have in London, and compared to a more formal planning system, which you might find in most European countries?
Yeah, I think that's the great benefit. It's live and it's changing, and it's not built on a rigid rule book generally. It's built on precedent, and so I think if you look at English law and English planning, there's a parallel, and it's a different cultural position. But it's the stiff sort of sense of respect that exists in some of those rule book societies that makes creativity pretty difficult.
In the context of the pandemic, as awful as it is, it seems to me that it does give huge opportunity to people thinking about the city, about where we go from here. What shape should the city be in a post-COVID environment?
Yeah, well, I do note that urban theorists and sociologists are having an absolute field day, because it turns all the kind of accepted norms on their heads, and that's great. So there's a lot of fundamental thinking going on, which I think is to be hugely welcomed. I think that likewise, having spent some time in the past commuting, I much prefer a kind of 15-minute city, which is definitely part of my world. But I have to say it's fine for some. But I always remember getting to Ahmedabad in India and meeting Kirti Shah, who this was very early days of post-student life, as it were, researching low-cost housing. And he reminded me that actually the thing that was most important with beyond the infrastructure for low-cost housing was the ability to persuade a bank manager to lend money for a bicycle to get around, because you've got to get your produce to market. So I think it's fine to talk about the 15-minute city, but one has to look at where people are living and what the nature of that kind of localism is in relation to the economic reality of the city. So I think it'd be very interesting to see, not just in the well-heeled kind of European cities, but in cities more broadly, how a theory like that can actually make sense for the less well endowed, if you will.
but it's interesting that obviously two of your major projects you're working on at the moment in the City of London. City of London is certainly not a 15-minute city, although it's very walkable, but not very little residential. Most people come in from outside, but also it does require that sort of vitality and agglomeration of the centre to maintain its role as a global hub. I mean, that I guess must be its future still. So that requires something that has almost a global vision of the future of cities, as well as the bicycles, which are obviously really important too.
I suppose my point is, how you make that act of transportation or movement civilized and kind of working in terms of distance and a sense of security is one that, the politicians and the city planners need to work on extremely hard. But I think it's clear that there are many ways of improving that. And I think obviously the way that something like the City of London feeds upon all those incredibly important neighbours, to make that act of movement easier is going to be absolutely crucial.
Yes, because I think that actually we look back to London's history often to think how we deal with the future. London's polycentrism is actually, I think, a great benefit for it, looking to a post-COVID environment where you are able to, or London is able to deliver that local environment, but also those local environments need to be well connected to the centre to maintain the vitality of not just the City of London, but the theatres, the art galleries, and all those things which make London such an important centre.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think a key is to see the transformation of something like London Bridge, one of those spokes that has been so well improved to make that access better. I think the gateways become incredibly important around the orientation of the centre. So a lot more work on infrastructure, please. I think it's really critical to the future.
Well, hopefully we still get some investment in infrastructure in London in the future as the government rebalances the UK economy. That we still need to have that investment in London if London is to continue to be the sort of economic foundation of UK PLC.
Yeah, but I think we've had the great fortune of working in Birmingham over the last few years, producing a building at Paradise Circus, and I'm incredibly impressed, by the vitality, the kind of the demography of a city like that is so interesting in terms of its appeal, and the way that we need to learn from the decentralized kind of policies of places like Germany, where civilized cities operate in a network, which has been fantastic success as long as the infrastructure is in there and is provided for. So again, that ease of movement is spectacular generally across a country that is of a kind of similar dimensions in a way, north-south. So kind of working from Freiburg in the south, up to Hamburg in the north. There's a weave that is really impressive. That's what we're lacking. That's why I think projects like HS2 are absolutely essential.
Certainly, our cities need to work, as you say, as a network to deliver growth and more equitable cities. So, Eric Parry, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your insights, and I look forward to seeing your next buildings coming out of the ground in the City of London and shaping our capital.
Thank you, Peter. Likewise, I look forward to sharing more experience of that with you.